Welcome back to the Reimaginers, a series where we turn to the past to explore how education has previously been reimagined, by whom and for what purposes. Today we'll look at an important moment in the history of disability rights activism. The devastating toll of COVID-19 has brought to the forefront the ways we think about, or fail to think about, safety and vulnerability. The quick turn to online learning last spring and the current reversals of in-person to online learning this fall painfully exposed the longstanding inequalities in the types of education different students receive. Under-resourcing schools and programs for students with special needs, combined with schooling practices that emphasize a singular mode of learning, has made this inequality systemic. The quick pivots to online learning has only reinforced these systemic inequalities rather than challenge them. The incarceration of young people for not logging on to Zoom, the inability of educators to meet the requirements of students' IEPs virtually, and the continued demand for standardized tests at such a disruptive moment reveals the catastrophic consequences for limiting our visions of what education can be. Indeed, these failures challenge us to reimagine a more inclusive educational system, responsive to the evolving needs of students and families. Today, we'll travel to Berkeley, California to learn more about how this might be possible from a disability rights activist group who challenged the University of California to reimagine its educational programs in powerful ways. I'm thrilled to be joined again by my co-host, Amber Joseph. Welcome, Amber. Today, Amber and I will be talking with Dr. Scot Danforth. Dr. Danforth is a professor and assistant dean of research at Chapman University. His scholarship examines political and ethical issues involving disabled young people and schooling in order to foster the development of democratic schools and communities that are accepting, supportive, and caring to all persons. Dr. Danforth has published numerous works, including his book, Becoming a Great Inclusive Educator. And prior to becoming university researcher and instructor, Dr. Danforth was a special education teacher for 6 years in Virginia, North Carolina, and Florida. Dr. Danforth, we're thrilled to have you join us today, so thank you so much for making the time.
Thank you. Thanks. Happy to be here.
I was fascinated reading your work about the rolling quads at Berkeley in the 1960s. And so for those watching, could you just provide a brief history of who the rolling quads were and kind of their legacy in the fight for disability rights?
Okay, so the rolling quads was a group of students with physical disabilities. They used wheelchairs. So these are quadriplegics and paraplegics. And they were at UC Berkeley in the late 60s. They were housed in a hospital. The university had a hospital on campus, and this turned into part of the difficulty. The university had no accessible housing, and so they put them into an empty ward, an empty floor in a campus hospital. And so they were treated like patients there. They had nurses taking care of them, and it had all the structure of a hospital, but they were students in every way too. And this was a group of maybe a dozen students, led by a guy named Ed Roberts and another guy named John Hessler. And by this point, they were both graduate students. And it turned into a fight, a battle of the students against the State Department of Rehabilitation and also against the university. And it's primarily a story of a group of students coming together. What is unique here is that you have to imagine yourselves at that time and realize there was no such thing as disability rights in 1969. There was no idea of people with disabilities uniting to fight for their rights and for inclusion and for access to education and jobs and et cetera. This was a bunch of kids, a bunch of students going to class in the day, partying in the evening, and coming up with political ideas. And they did it together. They fought to get greater control over their education, greater control over their lives, and they won. But the important thing for us is it really is the beginning of the West Coast of the West Coast version, the West Coast of the disability rights movement, that later, many years later, amounts to the Americans with Disabilities Act.
Yeah. Also, what resonated was the tension that could emerge in providing services. So Lucille Withington was the rehabilitation counselor who supervised the program at Berkeley's campus. Can you describe what her role was as the tensions between her and the students built? And then also more specifically, so this is a two-part question. Can you discuss how the students differed from Withington and the state and how they imagined the possibilities of the Department of Rehabilitation funds and disability programs actually working for them?
Right, so think of these students and what they needed, what they required from the Department of Rehabilitation in order to be students. Many of them needed personal attendants who would come in the morning, often in the morning and the evening, and would help with feeding, basic hygiene, help with everything, even during the day, with things like taking notes or getting around campus. Until the mid-60s, the wheelchairs weren't electric, and so they needed people to even push their wheelchairs. So that, in addition to that, the Department of Rehab was providing the housing and paying for the education. So there's a lot of money going into the support of these students. The difficulty, so Lucille Withington, she was not an unusual counselor, but she applied in a stringent way what we would view as a cost-benefit analysis. The annual reports for this program each year would list each student and would list how much money they spent on that student, but also would have projections into the future. If this student comes out of the university and gains employment, how much money will they be making? And what will the tax dollars coming back to the state be? This was viewed not just as helping and supporting people and providing access. This was viewed as investing money in people so that they become workers and they become taxpayers. And taxpayers will cost the state less money in the long run because they pay into the coffers and they accept less services. So her metric was all about cost benefit. Now, the other thing she did was she set up a series of standards for the university students that were higher than the university standards. So then she attempted to kick out 2 of the students, saying they weren't meeting the standards. But what you see in her activity is an element of social control. And this is what happens in programs around people with disabilities, whether it's adults or children. There's a heavy paternalism, a heavy assumption that the system and the professionals know best. And this is what these students were really bumping into, was the idea that non-disabled people who had no experience having a disability, knew more what they needed than what they did. So it was viewed as radical at the time, but they asserted themselves and said, no, we should be able to hire our own personal attendants. We should be able to train our own personal attendants. We should be supervising those attendants, not someone else, because then we can teach them to take care of my body in the way I want it to be cared for. It was really about asserting disabled people as full humans, as fully conscious, active, decision-making people, and not just as recipients in a large bureaucracy. Trying to think, did I answer? I don't know if I answered all parts of the question.
No, you definitely did. And then just a quick follow-up. You said that there were 2 different standards or sets of standards that the students were held to. What does that actually mean?
So what I mean is that think of when you're in the university and you're a student, any student, the university is if your grade point goes below a certain level, they'll put you on probation. They'll kick you out eventually. But the rehab system required a higher GPA average than the university did in order to remain in good standing. So 2 of the students had fallen below the rehab system's minimum GPA, not the university's. And they pulled funding from 2 of the students, which essentially meant even though the university didn't kick them out. They were going to have to leave because all their funds were gone. And so the students, the Rolling Quads, protested. They protested in a whole series of ways, some of them very dry and bureaucratic, involving meetings with rehabilitation higher-ups. And eventually they took it, as Berkeley people did in 1969, they took it out on campus and held a protest. It probably, from all accounts, was a very small protest compared to the Vietnam, uproar that was going on at the time. And it may have not been noticed by many people, but what they did and what Ed Roberts did as their leader, it was very smart, was he contacted local newspapers. And he got the local newspapers in, and he made sure to feed them information. And they did win, and the State Department of Rehabilitation pulled that counselor out, and they put in a very amenable counselor who essentially from that point on co-led the program with the students. Even the next year's evaluation of the program had a whole section written by the students. It was being run by the students with the support of a very flexible administrator.
I want to ask another question about those protests, but I also feel compelled to share, as you're talking about the different methods of protest, understanding the bureaucracy, when we're in this moment of sustained protest and thinking about how long that fight can continue to go to get the ends that you want, the different levers that you have to pull to do that, I think it just adds another layer to why this story is so resonant, at least for me right now. But you had mentioned the Vietnam War protests. There's the free speech movement that's happening at Berkeley's campus. And so, this isn't a story that we often hear associated with that activism, that it's very much in the same vein, but it doesn't seem like there were meaningful alliances across these different activists and their demands. And I'm curious, why was that maybe not the case? What was preventing those groups from forming alliances for, their different issues, but similar in some ways inserting, their ideals and things of that nature?
The alliances were difficult. People have made a lot of, when you get to the Section 504 protest, a sit-in at the federal building in April 1977, the federal building in San Francisco. They brought in all sorts of support. The Berkeley activists were the ones who ran this, and they even brought in the Black Panthers. One of the main groups that was providing food to the protesters were Black Panthers. So there was a lot of effort to reach across lines and access different activist communities. But these alliances were temporary, they were weak, and the different groups, whether it's the Mexican Americans fighting around the farm workers, the African Americans fighting civil rights and disability rights, these groups mostly operated independently.
So that's actually a good transition to the final question I have, which is really where this sits in history. So one thing that's really striking about your work is how you approach historical inquiry through a disability studies lens. In education, discussions about disability are often limited in the way we think about special education, primarily through a lens of services, providing services. However, that narrow view really obscures larger possibilities for ways to reimagine schools and schooling. So can you briefly describe what disability studies is as a discipline, and how might it help us reimagine education in the future?
That's a large question. So disability studies is multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary. There are people working in this field who are in sociology and public health, in English departments, in education, in all sorts of areas. I'm in the arts. There's tremendous work in the arts. So it's not within a certain discipline. It's cross-disciplinary. But it really begins with the experiences of disabled people. That's why the story of the Rolling Quads is a nice example. To give a contrast, the special education and rehabilitation, the orientation of those professions is what we often call the medical model. that comes from the perspective of non-disabled people who, for the most part, are afraid of having a disability. And they also have no experience or little experience with being a person with a disability. So lacking that experience, the medical model primarily frames disability as a situation of individual misfortune. It's a physiological anomaly, a physiological problem with functional difficulties, which fall to the individual, unfortunately. And the best that can be done is to provide services that help that person to become, and I'll use harsh words, more normal. Help the person to become less disabled and more normal, and gain the skills of a non-disabled person to some extent. But disability studies tends to embrace a social model. So a social model of disability says that the main issues are political. The main issues that people with disabilities face are not just what their bodies won't do, but the way that society responds to them, understands them, and essentially discriminates and oppresses against them and oppresses them. So it's a political problem more than it is a physiological problem. This difference makes all this makes all the world of difference. Are we primarily individualizing problems and saying, oh, here's the misfortune of so-and-so, let's help her? Or are we viewing folks with disabilities as a large, complex minority group who want access to what is good in society, to the opportunities, educationally, economically, employment, relationships, recreation, you name it, access and participation. And that is not brought about by treating disorders and impairments. That is brought about by political action. So mostly, if you think of disability politically, then you realize that much of what special education does is individualize things through IEPs and say that an individual student is not part of a minority group, is not part of a group knocking on the door trying to get in. There's someone who needs treatment, educational treatment, and an IEP is a document to provide treatment. And the idea is if the treatment is of high quality, maybe that person will get into general education. Maybe they'll be admitted into the primary path of education that has the greatest rewards. But it has to be earned, and it has to be supported by the professionals who are the helpers. But a political orientation, when we think of it politically, we think about inclusion. We think about how can we have communities of learners where we don't all have to be the same. In fact, we can be radically different. Suddenly, we're not just talking disability, we're talking race, we're talking language, we're talking immigration status, we're talking sexuality. All these differences, we don't have to be the same in order to learn together. And so how can we actually have schools that address and respect human differences, biological and social, simultaneously, all together, instead of requiring a certain uniformity simply to be admitted and respected. So it's really, disability studies generates a radical orientation towards inclusion, a very democratic orientation towards inclusion. And so for my work, I've worked on inclusive, the nuts and bolts of inclusive education. And more recently, I would say disability studies scholars are attempting to connect here, back to your earlier question about different activist groups. How can the folks in disability studies connect with the people who are worried about the mistreatment of LGBT youth? How can we connect to issues around race and ethnicity, social class, gender? How can we connect all of these activist groups in education so that we're not working independently? That's our next challenge.
Thank you for that. I mean, I know with me thinking about this as a social and political issue rather than a medical or services-based issue, really not necessarily saying, oh, this is the concrete without I would do to reimagine education, but it definitely opens a different lens. In thinking that, Amber, I know you were really excited about this episode, given your initial training as a special education teacher, where you said you didn't really have this disability rights activism piece in it. And I'm curious, after this conversation, what are you thinking about as you're thinking about reimagining education and what that might look like?
Right. I have so much to think about. And I'm not alone in that, because what we're really talking about is we're talking about a systemic shift. And I think, as we all know, because we're in the middle of watching another attempt to make one, that takes a really long time. But the thing that strikes me the most about the work is this notion of self-determination, because that's what I think about a lot when we talk about civil rights, is the idea that a group of people, whatever that group of people might label themselves as, versus, also how they're labeled by whatever entity is attempting to label them, what do those people want, and what do they say that they need to get it? And you see that talk so much in Black Power, and you see it so much in the present with other groups that have kind of taken that and attempted to run with it themselves. So I'm just thinking a lot about how students can be empowered to see their disability, whatever that might be, as actually something that doesn't come from a deficit model, but is actually an aspect of their identity. Because even in my time in the classroom, I've seen that so much around other aspects of identity. I would have never seen a rainbow flag in a classroom that I was in, even in high school. But we have rainbow flags all over the place. And that it just contributes, I think, to like an idea that you don't have to hide who you are. And so I'm wondering how we can take disability and make it an aspect of one's identity and not something that needs to be fixed. And the other thing that I'm just thinking a lot about in terms of reimagining is how we talk about special education services in relation to funding. Because so much of what came up for me in the Rolling Quad story is money. And, the idea of having these people attached to a number amount in some state bureaucratic office was something that stuck with me, and I don't think is that radically different, unfortunately, in how large school districts like New York City think about special education services. And so, yeah, I mean, there's just a lot. It seems like there's two things. One is like, how do students think about themselves as people with disabilities? But then how do bureaucratic entities like state education departments then think about students with disabilities not as people that need these expensive things, but are actually asking to have the system meet them where they are. And especially right now in all conversations about economics and budget cuts looming at every turn and over everybody's heads, I think the story is just a really powerful thing to return to see what's possible when people actually sit down and say what they need, and then there's an actual conversation about that.
Well, thank you both so much for sharing your knowledge and perspectives as we were thinking about reimagining education through the lens of the Rolling Quads and how they were able to do it for themselves. For those of you watching, please continue to keep this conversation going by sharing your thoughts on reimagining education from today's show with us on social media. And make sure to tune in as we continue to look for possible paths forward from the past. You've been watching The Reimaginers with Amber Joseph, Scot Danforth, and myself, Matt Kautz. See you next time.